you, Jhon Thompson. Jhon is native from Scotland. In arrived. No, you don't understand. Okay, bon. Moi, j'ai l'impression qu'on s'entend, mais j'ai l'impression que le micro. Okay. Is it okay? Okay. Okay, we will start this first plenary lecture. It's really a great pleasure to present you Jhon Thompson. Jhon is native from Scotland in the borders regions. He arrived in France in the end of the 80s, sorry. It was recruited, he was recruited in the CNRS in Montpellier. In Spain, his outstanding career in the CEF, Center for Functional and Evolutionary Ecology, as a director of research. His research takes place, in his own words, in the particularly fascinating setting of the Mediterranean region, with a focus on ecology, evolution, and conservation of the Mediterranean flora. Jhon's research is focused on these main themes: plant evolution and conservation, conservation status of population of rare and endemic plants, the knowledge of fine ecological niche of species for plants management, the analysis of the interfaces between ecological science and human society. A key element of Jhon's research is to link a robust ecological science for biodiversity conservation. He is president of the scientific committee of the Mercantour National Park and the Narbonnaise Regional Park in southern France, and also member of the scientific council of the Conservatoire Botanique National Méditerranéen. All people who work in ecology and evolution in the Mediterranean region know his essential textbook, Plant Evolution in the Mediterranean, Insights for Conservation, published 4 years ago by Oxford University Press. In this nice book, Jhon clearly demonstrates how the evolutionary and biogeographic approach is a key element to provide insight into conservation and management of the Mediterranean flora. So, Jhon is particularly relevant to tell us about a key topic, the science of plant conservation in a changing Mediterranean world. Jhon, the floor is yours.
Does it still work? Yes. Thank you, Frederic. Thank you all for being here and having eaten your breakfast so fast to be here. And thank you to the organizing committee for inviting me to this conference and to give a keynote speaker. It was a really lovely surprise to get the invitation. Once I got over the surprise, I wrote back immediately to ask them what theme they would like me to treat. And as you have noticed, this is a very efficient organization. I got a reply the same day to say that there was no particular theme that I had to talk about. What the organizers wanted was me to give a Mediterranean flavor to the International Botanical Congress. And I realized last night why, because this is the first time the IBC has been held in a Mediterranean basin country. And so I'm glad to be here. So, let's see if this works. The science of plant conservation in a Mediterranean world. If I could get the slides. Do I have to point it somewhere to change the slide? Thank you. So, the Mediterranean basin, it's one of 5 Mediterranean regions, as you all know, all situated between 30 degrees north and 45 degrees north, in these bands and south, the same bands. Please keep this in mind, these bands. I'm going to come back to them at the end of the start of my talk. Between 30 degrees and 45 degrees north for the Mediterranean basin. They all have very similar vegetation forms, a lot of congruence, which you all know about. But the Mediterranean basin also has its singular history, plate movements, the history of the onset of the climate. And of course, when you look at a map of the Mediterranean, you are struck by two things. It's surrounded by mountains, and it's full of islands, thousands of them. There'll be talks about the island flora in the Congress this week. So two rather particular singularities for a Mediterranean situation. It is not just a Mediterranean climate with an oceanic front, it is also a major basin which goes to the Far East. So, we're into the Mediterranean flavor. Now, to understand anything about the Mediterranean flora, you have to know something about history. And the history of the Mediterranean is very profound. It goes very deep. Tertiary tectonics started 20 million years ago and went on all the way through the Tertiary. A Mycenaean desiccation, which started at the end around 6 million years ago for about 800,000 years, when the Mediterranean Sea dried out. The Pliocene onset of the Mediterranean climate, less than 3 million years ago. And of course, all the glaciation periods which pushed plants further south and down the mountains during the Quaternary. And of course, since the Neolithic, the ever increasing human footprint. So the geological history is basically based on the major tectonic plaques, major tectonic plates, with the African plate pushing up and round from the Atlantic. A small microplate, the CS, the coarse Sardinian microplate, which has moved from Spain across towards Italy over the last 20 million years. European plate pushing down to the southwest, southeast, and of course, Arabian, Anatolian plates pushing. And it's all still moving. You could go to the lovely botanical gardens in Hambury on the French-Italian border and look back to Monaco, and you can still see, the young mountains being pushed under the older mountains. Now, about 6 million years ago, the Mediterranean dried out because the tectonics closed the Gibraltar Strait. And just to give you an idea of what the sort of connections are, I've drawn here in brown and yellow where at least land was to these places, across these areas. Across the Maltese Plateau, the Gibraltar Strait was closed. The islands of Corsica and Sardinia were linked to Italy. Though Italy didn't exist. And of course, the Aegean was full of land. That's 6 to 5 million years ago. It all opened up again, but at various periods, especially during the last glacier maximum, other connections were reformed between Corsica and Sardinia across the Aegean. And so the whole history has been a history of land bridges, disappearing, coming back again, disappearing, coming back again, which has allowed for plant migration in the phased evolution since the Tertiary to reconnect and disconnect, to reconnect and disconnect. So a lot of the patterns that we now see are probably very ancient, and they've just been reframed by new events. Phased evolution. And now, one of the most, to give this Mediterranean flavor, I can't do it without talking about endemic species and the richness of the flora. 25,000 plant species, or somewhere around that, 10% of world plants, 1% of land of the Earth's planet, of the Earth. So a very rich flora. Everybody talks about the Mediterranean hotspot of diversity. You go to any conservation meeting, any regional plan, people will situate their regional town plan thing in the Mediterranean area for all plans and work that is done on management in the south of France. We will start with the fact that we're in a Mediterranean hotspot of plant diversity. It's very important. With a lot of endemism, if you go onto the main islands of Corsica, Sardinia, Sicily, Crete and Cyprus and look at the rates of endemism, well, for the whole islands, the rates of endemism are around 10, 15%, almost 20 on Crete. That's for the islands. And a lot of it is narrow endemic, but a lot of disjunct endemism. which is very important in the Mediterranean flora. That means that an endemic species that you might find on Sardinia, you will probably find it on Corsica as well because of the connections that have been going on. Or in Calabria, because that was connected once upon a time. We have disjunct endemism as well as the narrow endemism. And this endemism occurs, even if it's on the islands, it's always nearly always in the mountains. The mountains are really important for endemism. And if you look at the map above, at the top, it's the map of Sardinia with all its different geological formations. You will find endemic species in the turquoise blue limestone. You will find endemic species in the southwest region of Sardinia here, and species endemic just to this region, and you will find endemic species to the Genegan Mountains. Microendemism is very important on these islands. And one of the islands stands out. It's Cyprus. Most of the big islands, Crete, Sardinia, Corsica, were linked to the continent during the periods I just evoked. Cyprus was not. It is an oceanic island. The oceanic crust of the Mediterranean, underneath the Mediterranean, as you can see on the right-hand side, it goes right through Cyprus. And so when you go to the Troodos Mountains, you have rocks which are from the oceanic crust. So that has been pushed up underneath the Mediterranean Sea. It was not connected to the continent. This pushing up went through several periods, with a second major period which pushed up the limestone mountains which face Turkey. So a very particular form of endemism on Cyprus. It has a much higher ratio of single island endemics and not the disjunct endemics typical of the other islands, with lovely species such as the golden oak and, of course, varieties of the Lebanese cedar. And of course, I don't have time to talk about this today, but in the Mediterranean, the natural heritage is very closely linked to its cultural heritage. And Cyprus is one of the best islands. It's also unique to see that because it's one of the oldest wine growing situations of the whole Mediterranean, where you can taste red wine with some of the old cépage, like, what was it called? I always forget the actual name. The Oftalmo and other old wine cépage, grape varieties that are grown. And of course, you can taste the lovely, sweet Comanderia wine. There's a strong link between nature and culture. Well, my vision of culture, anyway. And of course, endemic species. There's a sort of a duality in endemic species. They are the old endemic species that have been there since the tertiary, that have persisted in relictual, moist, often mountain habitats, such as this Ramonda or rhododendron. And a second type of persistence, the typical Mediterranean endemics that have evolved since the climate has been Mediterranean, which live in this persistent niche of typical Mediterranean conditions. Another element of the Mediterranean flavor is, of course, not just endemism, but east-west divergence. You could take two oak trees, Quercus suber and Quercus ilex, and if you look at the genetic diversity, you will see in the top that it's marked by these east-west patterns of divergence. But in fact, these patterns of east-west divergence were created very differently in these two oak species. The Quercus ilex has migrated from the east and spread down this way through the tertiary connections and then come back up to the south of France, whereas Quercus suber was on the old microplate of Sardinia, Calabria, the Kabylie, the Balearic, which has been pushed round towards Sicily and Italy to create this pattern of genetic divergence. They're on different rock types they are on the same rock types that have the same origin. So two different ways of creating an east-west divergence. And on a smaller scale in the Aegean, across the mid-Aegean trench, you will find different species that have evolved in divergence in an east-west pattern, either side of the deep trench that runs down through the Aegean. So another east-west divide within one of the seas of the Mediterranean, the Aegean. So, That was what I wanted to give you as a Mediterranean flavor to the conference. Endemism, divergence, history. But it is also the major element for plant conservation. Basically, we can write a history now of these different forms. I've written 2 books on the Mediterranean. Between the publication of the 2 books, there were about 200 papers written in 15 years, a lot of it by scientific phytogeographers and phylogeneticists. We didn't have this information 35 years ago. We have an enormous amount of information now on phylogeography, phylogeny, genetic divergence, which allows us to write a history of the Mediterranean in many ways. We've been thinking about endemism for a long time. We now have a lot of importance on divergence in endemic species in relation to historical processes of climate change, in relation to hybridization, as you will see later on in the conference, in relation to polyploidy. There are symposia on polyploidy as well, and the importance of these drivers of evolution. I cite Frédéric's work. I've got my book on here. We've written stories about this, and we've benefited from a long history of investigation in the Mediterranean flora. We heard yesterday evening about the Spanish Botanical Society and its history. Well, the same thing in France. In the early 18th, 19th century, people were getting interested in the Mediterranean flora. What is this Mediterranean flora? What is its unicity? What it's all about? And it's gone on since the early 19th century, the Condol, into the 20th century with Flahaut, Amberger, Pierre Cazel, and Frédéric and I, we both benefit a lot from this history of knowledge on the Mediterranean flora. And this knowledge that we have is, in fact, a heritage, just like the natural heritage we try to conserve. We have a scientific patrimony, it's a heritage as well. And it's not just in the past, it's a mix of information, ancient, recent, ongoing, as well as I'm going to talk, and we have to superimpose the different information that we have into a phased evolution of species so that we can have a proper overall view. And the overall view that I have of the Mediterranean flora is that it has an incredible evolutionary potential. But history hasn't finished, and things are changing, and changing fast in the Mediterranean as elsewhere. I've just thrown up a couple of slides to illustrate climate change. On the right, this is the Mediterranean region in that north-south latitudinal band in the Mediterranean basin. That same band across the rest of the world, but not a Mediterranean climate, and then the global situation. And you can just see that the speed of increasing temperature is going faster here than here than here. A comparison of change in the Mediterranean region to elsewhere in the rest of the same latitude. Temperatures are rising faster. And in more recent work, in this band compared to elsewhere is on the left, here, but still in the band, change in temperature and change in precipitation. As the temperature is rising, we're not picking up changes in precipitation, whereas in the Mediterranean part of the latitudinal band, with increasing temperature, we're catching decreasing precipitation. So the summer drought is becoming more and more arid, not just in its intensity, but in the length of the summer drought. What we're experiencing at the moment in the last 3 years is an early start to the summer in the spring, which causes problems for plant growth. It's already a situation that was always talked about, a summer drought. You know, the warmest part of the year, plants can't grow because it's a drought. Well, this summer drought is increasing. With a whole range of different impacts. I can talk about this later, but from the Mediterranean Sea to the top of the Mediterranean mountains, we are detecting changes, both in terms of species distributions, community dynamics, fires, all sorts of changes that I let you discover. It's a profusion of impacts due to climate change. Obviously, climate change doesn't act alone. It interacts with direct human impacts on the landscape as well, which are going to stop species from migration. And all this has made me realize that, well, in addition to the dimension of endemism and heritage and past historical change that we have as scientists, there are two other dimensions that we need to look at as scientists. We need to relate to management, conservation management that is going on at the moment, is the conservation for the future, and give more attention to the changes in the dynamics and the range dynamics of species, and the situations of ongoing evolution that we can detect, with the overall objective linked to my overall view, the conservation of evolutionary potential. And I'm going to focus on this conservation of evolutionary potential and this sort of think about the future with another type of distribution pattern in the Mediterranean, not east-west, but north-south, a Western Mediterranean distribution pattern, which we call Ibero-Provençal, with species that are distributed from the south of Spain or even the north of Africa into the south of France. 3 examples here, with a decline in terms of population abundance as you go north, with central populations to the south, peripheral populations once you get into the south of France. Peripheral populations have long interested scientists. One of my ex-PhD students did a biological review of the subject, which detected there's been very little interest in the ecology of peripheral populations, and yet this is where genetics and ecology could meet to create incipient species which could be even more interesting in the future than endemic species in terms of evolution. The peripheral populations in this particular region of long interested botanists and ecologists, we know nearly 200 species roughly in the French database for species in the south of France, in Mediterranean France, which have this distribution pattern, with the populations becoming more and more fragmented as they come north. So we've been very interested in the spatial patterns of these populations in the south, in Mediterranean France, and their genetic and ecological originality, because they could be very interesting in the context of climate change. Their spatial structure is quite simple. They are found in a majority in 3 areas of south of France. To the left, the darker the blue, the more you have peripheral populations of these species. So there are 3 areas of importance. To the left is around Narbonne in the southwest of the district of the Mediterranean France. The second is in the middle, that is the Blue Coast and the Calanque National Park area, and to the right is the Alpes-Maritimes north of Nice. 3 poles of diversity of peripheral populations. 2 major geographic barriers, the Rhone Valley and the Moor Plain, where you had done all of this distribution. This distribution is limestone, except for one area in between the 2 and the where the number 2 is. It's a barrier here with its acidic rocks. This pattern, the pattern is very clear for many species. Some species are in all 3 of these areas, some species are in just 2 of these areas, and some only 1, with some examples. And when you look at patterns of genetic diversity in the species in these peripheral populations in southern France, well, you can pick up divides. This is a story of an Asteraceae, the Caryolophus, where there is a barrier, a genetic barrier of genetic divergence between the Balearic Islands and the rest of the distribution. The Balearic Islands were connected about 6 million years ago to the continent, so perhaps there was colonization at this time, but never since. So there's a distinct genetic barrier, and then another barrier between the southeast of the Spanish peninsula and the northeastern France. So the peripheral populations are closely related to the populations in northern Spain. Same in Atractylus humilis, which Mathilde Latran and my other students are working on. There's a poster on this subject with barriers that are from northeast Spain into France, a genetic profile. It doesn't start in France, it starts in Spain. In convolvulus lanuginosus, the genetic differentiation occurs roughly between the northeast of Spain and France. And then there's a barrier across the Rhone Valley, from the west of the Rhone to the east of the Rhone, another barrier amongst peripheral populations which show divergence amongst themselves. And a similar pattern for floral systems and reproductive biology. If you look at a Narcissus species, Narcissus dubius, which has a styler polymorphism, there's a symposium on this subject, with long-styled plants and short-styled plants. If you look at its distribution from Valence to Provence, as you go up into the Aragon and the Stepic region, the circles become black. They're white elsewhere. Black is monomorphic populations, white is dimorphic. We are losing the polymorphism as you go up into Aragon, and once you get across the Rhone Valley, you completely lose the polymorphism. There is a shift in the reproductive biology with a whole range of floral traits that go with this shift. So there are changes going on in terms of genetic and reproductive polymorphisms. What about ecology? There's a lot of studies of the ecology of peripheral populations compared to central populations, but what we decided to do was take 11 species, 9 families, and compare the ecology of central and peripheral populations from the south of France from the south of France in peripheral populations to the south of Spain, and see if across this single major region, species show similar patterns. Well, we looked at the climatic niche. The blue circle is the whole region. The red rectangle is where the climatic niche of central populations, and the blue little rectangle is the climatic niche of peripheral populations, which is always a subset of central populations. It's not necessarily marginal, it's a subset. In terms of broad habitat types, when you compare the different species from A to K, which is the 11 species, if it's green, the central populations occur in the same broad habitat types as the peripheral populations, which is nearly always the case. It's only in the orchid species, in fact, that we see major differences in the broad habitat type. However, once you get to the fine-scaled ecological niche, where we put our quadrats and noted the percentage of rocks, of other species, we took soil samples. This time, for the 11 species, if you have a color in the square, that means for this trait and this species in the column, there are differences. And you can see that for 40% of the parameters that we studied, we picked up differences between the fine-scaled ecological niche of central populations and those in peripheral populations. So basically, there are ecological differences. We know roughly what the traits are, and a much narrower niche breadth in the south of France, which isn't surprising. So there's evolutionary potential. We have picking up genetic divergence, we've picked up ecological divergence. So there is evolutionary potential in these populations, but they are rare, they are isolated, and we have to think about conservation action for them. Now, often when you see these patterns of geographic differences and isolation, range limits, people start thinking about helping migration, bringing in new material or moving material. That doesn't go down very well when we go into conservation groups in the south of France. People are very prudent and very cagey about anything to do with this assisted migration. Even though we have now the ecology, we have information on the ecology, the genetics of species, it's still very dicey to talk about assisted migration, which I fully expect, because it's not just a question. It's not as straightforward as all that. to do such work. Okay, we are in the Anthropocene. There are barriers to plant movements. Climate change is going fast. Species are on the brink of extinction. This could be, in some ways, a last-minute solution. It's been done for Zelkova on Sicily. I don't know what the results are, but there's a program of assisted migration for the species, which I understand. And also, are we ready to accept the sacrifice of losing diversity? But at the same time, for some people, assisted migration or reintroductions in general causes a loss of value. When we start moving plants and putting them into new areas, well, we lose the value of the natural situation. And there is, of course, there have been major criticisms of this, the approach of moving species around, particularly in animals, because that can create biological invasions. And in this attempt to speed up plants' responses to climate change, the question is, should we sacrifice the chance, the tentatives of evolution that these species would be going through if we didn't do anything? These small steps of evolution, we will bypass them. So the question is open. I haven't got the solution for you this morning, but one thing I do think is that in this anticipation, the first step is when you have peripheral populations, which are rare, which have low abundance inside their populations, well, let's do reinforcement. The first step is to reinforce these so that they can evolve. So the assisted is just to reinforce locally with local material, if possible, or the genetic material which is around, which is similar. Do reinforcement around their sites and reinforcement within their sites. Enhance local abundance and potential variability that can evolve. So we will facilitate the plant's response to climate change. That, for me, in my mind, is the first step, but on a major scale. We've done it for some species. This is the Spanish iris, which occurs at one. This is only one site in the south of France, but it's abundant in two different genetic forms in Spain and Morocco. Where we've reinforced the site, there were just two major plots of the species at this site, and we've reinforced from the top of the site where there was a small plot, natural plot, all through its distribution, which is about 2 kilometers from here to here, and a whole set of new reintroductions in the middle of its distribution in the site. This is the dynamics of the natural populations. We started in 2010. From 2012, after 1 year after reintroductions, to 2024, in the two major natural plots here. So you can see the variability, and you can see the effects of the drought that we've been having in this site for the last few years. This drought means high salinity. This plant is in the division between salt water, brackish water, and fresh water. It's an estuary. And it prefers the more freshwater areas. So we think there's a problem of salinity going on as well. When you look at our reinforcements, over the same period, we've had the similar natural dynamics going down, and it's gone right down since 2020, as in the natural population. If we'd just done this, we would have said to ourselves, well, our reintroduction was a failure. But in fact, given what's happening in the natural population, ours is not that much of a failure, because we also sowed seeds, and we've also been looking for new colonization in the site. So the first flowers we ever saw after introduction of seed plots here were 5 years later. The orange. These were seed plots where finally seeds were producing flowers in these sites, which have gone up and then down again. And the most important thing is that after, well, nearly 15 years, after about 6 or 7 years, the yellow columns. This is the apparition of flowers in sites we'd never put anything in. This area here. New populations were starting to be formed, but only after about 7 years, and they are becoming the most important in the site. So basically, I believe that this reinforcement of sites is an important first step, but what we have to tell people is it takes a long time. Judging these experiments after 3, 4, 5 years is just not sufficient. This has taken 12 years for us to have this first real result. So that was the part on that I wanted to do, the dimension of science for conservation, the second part. And now the third part is situations of ongoing evolution and the importance, how do I go back? Up. And the importance of monitoring contemporary evolution that is going on. I'm going to skip this because we lost a bit of time. And just talk to you about one of my favorite subjects, which I've probably talked to some of you before, the ongoing adaptation to climate change in chemotypes, chemical forms of Thymus vulgaris in the south of France, which you can see there are two major types of chemotypes. There are the yellow ones and the black ones. The yellow ones are non-phenolic chemotypes, which live in cold winter environments in the low altitude zone through here. And the black types, which are the phenolic chemotypes, which are more adapted to less cold climates in the winter, but a harsher summer, a summer drought. So we have these two chemical forms. We've been doing transplant experiments, experimental studies of freezing tolerance, and we've really detected that the non-phenolic types, which go in the blue zone here, are cold adapted, because if you look at the winter temperatures in the non-phenolic sites, in this cold, misty broom of a winter's morning, this is here, the extreme winter temperatures since the 1950s, till the study that was done of this map of chemotypes, which was done in the late 1970s. So basically, a cold adapted form in the valley bottoms, and a more summer drought adaptation of phenolic forms around the outside of this basin, which has a milder winter, as you can see, from its lowest winter temperatures in red. You can see the marked differences between the extreme winter temperatures of the two areas. This is not mean values, this is extreme values. And I strongly believe as an ecologist, we should be looking more at extreme values than mean values when we talk about climate change. So that was the picture when I first started a lot of my work. This picture of cold we showed this cold adaptation during the 10 years of the first 10, 15 years of my career in Montpellier. But after doing that, I went back to the climate data a few years ago. So here, my first graph here. Since 1989, there has never been a freezing event which our experiments would show that should knock out the phenolic types in the valley bottoms. It's never gone below minus 15 degrees, which is a temperature which is very significant for time in our experimental work. 30 years of several cold temperatures, 30 years without a single one. And so we decided to monitor redo the map. We put transects onto the map. We couldn't do all 250 populations, but we did 6 transects where we went from 12 phenolic populations. We took 12 mixed populations and 12 non-phenolic populations. So on the transects going down into the cold valley. What we got as our first results we went, the phenolic populations, the black ones, on the outside of the bastion, no change. No change at all. The mixed populations, the mixed sites in this transition zone between the two altitudinal contours that are where you find mixed populations, well, the 12 mixed populations, we picked up a significant increase in the frequency of phenolic types, and some of the mixed populations had become phenolic, black. And in the valley bottoms, where we had non-phenolic populations at 100%, well, there were 12 at the start. Oops, sorry. 12 at the start of our study, which is now 50 years ago, this map. And now 7 of the 12 have phenolic types inside them. This was done 15 years ago. We've redone it again this year, and we have found new populations that were yellow 50 years ago, which are now going black and turning into phenolics. That's because of the lack of the coldest day. But since the last few years, we started looking at the other extremes, the hottest day of the year, which I've put up on the map. As you can see, the hottest day of the year is getting hotter. We've also looked at summer rainfall, and there's not been much change in summer rainfall, but over the last 7 years, we haven't picked up on summer rainfall. It's staying very low. It's staying at its extreme values for a long period of time. Before, you can see it's going up and down and up and down. That's typical of the Mediterranean, the irregular rainfall between years. This irregularity is becoming more regular and becoming more dry. So the new chapter in this work is to look at what's happening during the summer as well. And for the first time in 35 years that I've worked on time, I've been observing mortality. And this mortality occurs in the phenolic populations, those that are adapted to summer drought, in the harshest conditions in the Corbière region down towards the Spanish border, and in the phenolic sites around the mountain that have been in all my pictures. We are picking up significant mortality in the phenolic sites, but not in the non-phenolic sites, which have a good soil and a retention possibility. So we now have, there's now a PhD student now who's come from Denmark, Andreas Faber, who's looking at new extremes of temperature and humidity, not just. I always used to say this is a wonderful illustration in time, not of changes in distribution, but in changes in the organization of genetic diversity in relation to climate change. Finally, there may well be changes in the distribution. And the last thing I have to say on this is that we are working with the conservative, it's a Natural 2000 site, and we've finally begun working with conservation management so that they start to look at the evolutionary potential of this species across this major ecological transition, which is all in one site of the Natura 2000 then. But I'm into the last minute of my talk. We started late, so I have to finish very quickly. The last minute, a scientific approach has these 3 dimensions, the endemism and the heritage, so important. People always talk about we are in a Mediterranean hotspot when we have meetings in southern France. And endemism is always a priority. The future, shifting attention now to species range limits because that could be the future. Anticipate, perhaps, this future. And of course, ongoing evolution, and now we have to shift to more common species to illustrate to people. We have sentinel, we have these indicator species like Thymus that the climate is changing. And if we can shift this scientific approach towards these themes, then we will get more towards the conservation of evolutionary potential in the flora. And this, in fact, it's a sort of a philosophy of plant conservation. We had a PhD student in philosophy, and when she saw all this that I was presenting in scientific dimensions in conferences around the region, she analyzed that as 3 main temporal attitudes, 3 posture, a remember posture, a remember attitude, past historical change, an anticipation attitude, and a monitoring attitude, which she describes in her PhD thesis. So this vision of conservation based on processes can also be explained to people in perhaps a more simple manner for them, but under conditions of uncertainty. And I insist on that all the time in my talks to regional people. But I do tell them as well, there is one thing that is sure, that I have no doubt about. The times they are changing. Bob Dylan said it in 1963, and 60 years ago in 1964, his song was going through the hit parades of the English-speaking world. Come gather around, people, come together. And admit that the waters have grown. Admit, denial. You can't, 1964, forget about denial. We can't deny it. And of course, you better start swimming or sink like a stone. The time for action. I often talk about this, and 60 years later today, to stand here in front of you and remember his song, well, it's one way of getting things across to the public. I've already tried and it works quite well. And the last minute, also, I'm full of admiration. I work on the Mediterranean flora, and so many people work in difficult conditions of troubles and conflicts and not being able to access their sites and do their work properly, and the lack of funding and the gaps in our knowledge in many countries because we just cannot do the work. Well, there was a PhD last year in Montpellier at the CEF, which I gave myself as a priority to go and see and listen to the defense about climate and socio-political troubles in relation to fires in the Mediterranean region. I'm full of admiration for this type of work. And if we're going to do a manifesto for this conference, then we should be looking at countries where it is difficult to do the research and help the funding, assist people in these situations. Voilà, so 3 scientific dimensions, 3 temporal attitudes. The Mediterranean flora, for me, it's a natural and cultural heritage of great beauty, and we must reveal this beauty to people. Sandy said it a little bit yesterday, plants are the structure of the landscape. And there's an enormous attraction to the Mediterranean region. It's one of the major tourist definitions of the world. We have to appeal to people's sentiments. And at the moment, I'm writing a new book, which is on literature, landscapes, and flora. I work with artists. We're going to bring wild plants into the city of Montpellier, I hope, on big street art walls with wild species, endemic species that people can see. A cyclamen balearicum on a big wall in Montpellier is one of my objectives for the years to come. And of course, as Sandy said yesterday evening, the senses and contact of young people with wildflowers. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for inviting me. This is a moment in my scientific career today. A plenary lecture at the International Botanical Congress. I would never have believed it, so thank you very, very much. I'll remember all my life.
Thank you very much, Jhon, for this very inspiring lecture. We have time for one question now? One question. Thank you, Gonzalo.
I kept my time exact on, but we started so late. But I'm here all week. You can ask me questions during the week. I've got an email. I'm here.
Okay.
But if anybody wants to ask a question, I would love it.
No question, it's clear, so we have just in time. Okay, thank you again, Jhon.
Thank you all.